Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Donald Trump's lawyer has threatened legal action against a former aide about the launch of a new book about the presidency. Steve Bannon had been Mr. Trump's chief strategist, and he's been accused of breaking confidentiality agreements. Earlier, the White House released a blistering attack by the president on his former aide. In it, Donald Trump said, "Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. Now that he is on his own, Steve is learning that winning is not as easy as I make it look." He went on, "Steve had very little to do with our historic victory, which was delivered by the forgotten men and women of this country. Yet Steve had everything to do with the loss of a Senate seat in Alabama, held for more than 30 years by Republicans. Steve does not represent my base. He's only in it for himself." Well, our US correspondent Cordelia Lynch is in Washington. We saw Hannah Thomas-Peter getting blasted by the weather a bit earlier. Cordelia, this is Steve Bannon getting blasted by the president.
He is indeed, and a rather full-throttle assault on Steve Bannon. After the fire and fury, now comes the fallout. Quite remarkable how much impact a so far unpublished book is having here in DC. Now, Donald Trump's team have issued a cease and desist letter to Steve Bannon, accusing him of violating a non-disclosure agreement, of making defamatory remarks. The White House regard this book to be full of factual inaccuracies, the work of tabloid fiction in their view, and they have also issued a similar cease and desist notice to Michael Wolff and his publisher, where they demand that this book is no longer disseminated. That seems unlikely at this stage. There are many advanced copies already being looked at, and lots of bookshops across the world already trying to get their hands on it. Now, Steve Bannon has been trying to somewhat mend fences, it would appear, after that incendiary interview he appears to have given Michael Wolff in this book. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The President of the United States is a great man. You know, I support him day in and day out, whether going through the country giving the Trump miracle speech or on the show or on the website. So I don't think you have to worry about that.
So really trying to cast himself as a continued supporter of Donald Trump, who was clearly very hurt, irritated and annoyed by the revelations contained in this book and by the seemingly unfettered access that Michael Wolff was given to Steve Bannon and other key insiders. Donald Trump was clearly listening in to what Steve Bannon had to say as well last night. Here's what he had to say when asked by reporters at a meeting about immigration not long ago.
I don't know, he called me a great man last night, so, you know, he obviously changed his tune pretty quick. All right, thank you all very much. Thank you. I don't talk to him. I don't talk to him. That's just a misnomer. Thank you.
Well, that was Cordelia Lynch giving us the reaction from Washington. Let's get a bit more on this now, this row between the president and Steve Bannon. Joining us also in Washington is Robbie Serf, who's the assistant editor at Reason, which is a magazine that describes itself a magazine of free minds and free markets. Robbie, thanks for your time. I mean, the president is at the best of times a pretty thin-skinned sort of chap, but even by his standards, this is an extraordinary reaction, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Bannon broke the first rule that he had established, which is that you're not supposed to ever attack Trump's family members, particularly. That Trump doesn't take too kindly to that. Of course, we know that that this feud has kind of been coming for a while, in ways because Trump is a personality character, a figure. And Bannon is a deeply ideological man who, I mean, he just said it in his kind of partial "I still support Trump" statement that he made that you just played. He said, "I support Trump, I support the agenda." To Bannon, what matters is the economic nationalist agenda that he hoped to push vis-a-vis the Trump candidacy and Trump presidency. But it was never about the individual himself. He just saw Trump as a possible successful vehicle for that agenda.
And Robbie, what's interesting also, ongoingly interesting about the Trump White House is the number of people in there who are not politicians and maybe are not always used to having their words scrutinised. So this word treasonous that Steve Bannon has allegedly used, I mean, that is an extraordinarily charged expression.
It is, and in one sense it's difficult. It's a little difficult for me to imagine Bannon actually using that word. That sounds like a word a kind of left-of-center media person would use about what Trump's behavior has been like about the Russian collusion, because we've heard, Bannon say that he doesn't believe any of it. Now, that said, a very reliable news website that covers politics in D.C., Axios, reported, I just saw that apparently the author of this book, who's alleging all these quotes, that he has video to support that these things were actually said the way that they were said. So that obviously, if we get to hear that, would help support that these things were said. We could believe that they were said, but we would like to know that. And I agree with you that they're not political figures, and that might be the reason they were so forthcoming. I mean, Trump is from the world of reality television, right? The world of entertainment. His kind of sphere, the people in it are used to almost stirring up drama as part of their semi-scripted reality that they occupied on television, right? That's very different from the political realm, where you want to keep things to yourself, or you want to make sure if you're telling reporters things that you don't want traced back to, you have to be very clear. You have to spell out, this is off the record, I don't want to be recorded. You have to go through things like that, things that maybe Trump and people in his orbit just didn't understand, coming from such a different world.
You can either see this, Robbie, as some fairly profound accusations against the president, or you can call it mudslinging between two people who've fallen out. What do you think the American public makes of this?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, the American public is not a monolith at this point. We are so polarized. We are so in different camps for how we relate to this president. I mean, there are so many people that despise Trump, and there are so many people that love him. And then there are a lot of people in the middle who he wasn't their first choice. His agenda isn't their first choice, but they think that a lot of the people criticizing him have gone off the deep end. How do these various factions respond to this? I don't know. I mean, I think Trump loyalists are going to stick with Trump, even though they liked Bannon. I mean, there's some evidence that kind of the Breitbart world might be moving away from Bannon. So I definitely think the people who are in it for Trump are going to stick by the president, regardless of what Bannon says. And this will end up hurting Bannon more than anybody else.
Good to talk to you. That is Robbie Suave, the assistant editor at Reason magazine.
The row between Donald Trump and his former top aide, Steve Bannon, has intensified, with lawyers for the president threatening legal action. It follows comments attributed to Mr. Bannon in a new book about the Trump presidency. He's quoted as saying that a meeting between Mr. Trump's son and a group of Russians during the presidential campaign was treasonous. Our North America editor John Sopel reports.
Hell hath no fury like a Bannon scorned, it would seem. Steve Bannon, who was described as the brains behind Donald Trump, is now out in the Washington cold after his extraordinary attack. The warm words of last summer, but a distant memory.
I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
But Bannon was fired soon afterwards and has now had his revenge, rounding on the president's son and son-in-law over a meeting they had with a Kremlin-linked lawyer at Trump Tower during the campaign, saying, even if you thought that this was not treasonous or unpatriotic or bad shit, and I happen to think it's all of that, you should have called the FBI immediately. And that's provoked rage and fury in the White House, the president issuing this unprecedented statement about a close colleague. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. Steve doesn't represent my base, he's only in it for himself. Steve was rarely in a one-on-one meeting with me and only pretends to have had influence to fool a few people with no access and no clue. Today at the White House, they're lawyering up. orders to Steve Bannon to cease and desist, threats to the publisher too. And the response from Mr. Bannon last night? Why, to declare his unfailing support for the president.
The President of the United States is a great man. You know, I support him day in and day out, whether going through the country giving the Trump miracle speech or on the show or on the website.
And that brought this response from Mr. Trump today.
He called me a great man last night, so, he obviously changed his tune pretty quick.
The White House is pushing back hard on the contents of this book, describing the author, Michael Wolff, as an unreliable witness and a fantasist. That despite him being given unprecedented access to the workings of the West Wing and recording hours and hours of conversations. And even if only 50% of the book is accurate, it still paints a damning portrait of a White House that's dysfunctional and a president who's paranoid. No wonder Donald Trump is so angry. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
First, Donald Trump's lawyers have demanded that a book painting a deeply unflattering portrait of the president and his administration be stopped. Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, isn't due out until next week, but excerpts in the press have already provoked unbridled rage in the Oval Office. Warwick O'Brien reports from Washington.
The fire, the fury, the arsonist. Former chief strategist for the president, Steve Bannon, lights most of the matches in Michael Wolff's book. When the president's son and son-in-law met Russians in Trump Tower offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, Bannon is quoted as saying,
"Even if you thought that this was not treasonous or unpatriotic or bad and I happen to think it's all of that, you should have called the FBI immediately."
Speaking about the Mueller investigation into alleged Russian collusion,
"This is all about money laundering. Their path to Trump goes right through Paul Manafort, Don Jr., and Jared Kushner. It's as plain as the hair on your face."
Yesterday, the president responded by saying Bannon had become unhinged. Today, the second cease and desist letter from Trump's lawyers saying Bannon has violated a non-disclosure order and accusing him of defaming the president. This morning, Bannon appeared on Breitbart Radio. His reaction, bizarrely, a conciliatory thimbleful of water from the man who started the forest fire.
The President of the United States is a great man. You know, I support him day in and day out, whether going through the country giving the Trump miracle speech or on the show or on the website. So I don't think you have to worry about that.
The president's reaction to that today.
Did Steve Bannon betray you, Mr. President?
Thank you.
Any words about Steve Bannon?
I don't know. He called me a great man last night, so, he obviously changed his tune pretty quick.
Bannon, just one of the book's main characters. Others have refuted the veracity of the quotes attributed to them. The author, Michael Wolff, says he's taped interviews, though.
I, Donald John Trump.
Some of the most colourful stuff in the book allegedly comes from inside Team Trump. The author says that the inner circle, for example, didn't even believe they could win the presidency. The book paints a picture of a president with at best problems with concentrating, with at worst personality disorder. For example, Wolff says that ex-campaign aide Sam Nunberg was called in to explain the 27 amendments to the Constitution to the new president. Wolff quotes Nunberg as saying, "I got as far as the 4th Amendment before his finger is pulling down on his lip and his eyes are rolling back in his head." In other sections of the book, based on interviews with White House Deputy Chief of Staff Katie Walsh, Wolff writes, "He didn't read, he didn't really even skim. Some believe that for all practical purposes he was no more than semi-literate. He trusted his own expertise, no matter how paltry or irrelevant, more than anyone else's. He was often confident, but was just as often paralysed, less a savant than a figure of spluttering and dangerous insecurities. It was," said Walsh, "like trying to figure out what a child wants." Walsh says she didn't say this, as does Tony Blair.
I mean, this story is literally a fabrication from beginning to end.
Responding to the book's claims that he warned Trump that the British were spying on him. It's the Bannon intervention that matters, though. He provided the intellectual infrastructure for the Trump campaign. And with this very public divorce, the question now, when it comes to the two men and the support base... So, who gets custody?
I think at the end of the day, the Breitbart audience is going to stay with Donald Trump because they have nowhere left to go. They don't trust Speaker Paul Ryan. They don't trust the Republican establishment. They've rejected all of that. So they're going to stay in Donald Trump's camp.
But also, by talking up the Mueller investigation to alleged Russian collusion, Bannon has pulled the rug from under efforts by some to delegitimize it. The bigger question now, with midterms in November, how will the electorate respond to this chaos? Is wildfire fatigue setting in?
Parag O'Brien reporting from Washington. We're joined now from the same city by Sebastian Gorka, the former Deputy Assistant to President Trump and a Fox News contributor. Sebastian Gorka, thanks for joining us. Last night, Mr. Trump said that when Mr. Bannon lost his job, he lost his mind. Has he?
I know Steve Bannon. I've been in touch with him since this story broke. You're not going to get me saying that he lost his mind. That's the president's prerogative. This book didn't attack me, and we don't even know if Wolf's assertions are correct. If somebody who's as much a non-conservative as Tony Blair calls Michael Wolf a liar, I think we have to take this all with a large pinch of salt, if not a bucket of salt, John.
But it's difficult for you because you're close to Bannon, you're close to Mr. Trump. So where do your loyalties lie?
My loyalties lie with the United States of America and the republic for which it stands. This isn't about Steve Bannon or the president. It's about a hack. This guy, Michael Wolff, his last book, 13 people complained that the quotes that he included with that last book were made up and fabricated. The excerpt that was published in the New York Magazine yesterday was so full of things that I can prove to be factually incorrect from my time in the White House. He's just a guy trying to sell books. And The Guardian is a rabid right-wing loony left rag, and of course they want to attack the president. Absolutely.
But the problem is that a lot of it has a kind of suspicion of truth around it, in that many other people have come forward in the last, well, 6 to 8 months saying much the same thing.
Well, look, your actual intro listed all the people who've denied the quotes from Michael Walsh's book, from Katie Walsh to the former Prime Minister of the UK. So let's draw our own conclusions about what this person is trying to do. And the idea, this is in the excerpt published yesterday that I read, the idea that Donald Trump didn't want to win the presidency, that's the most asinine statement about Donald Trump I have read in a long time, and it kind of qualifies who Michael Wolff really is.
But then there are things which, when you look at them, really seem to stack up. I mean, Trump's team, and you described them as this, were a team of outsiders pushing against the elite. And yet Wolff's book does indeed deal with those sort of people that Mr. Trump was talking to, particularly Roger Ailes and Mr. Murdoch, neither of whom could be said other than to be in the elite.
But it's all derogatory. He may have dealt with those individuals, but I want to hear the audio tapes. I want to hear the individuals who are in those conversations confirm that that's what they said. And nobody, not Steve Bannon, not Katie Walsh, not Tony Blair, nobody has confirmed the veracity of anything Michael Wolff has published to date. So look, let your viewers judge Michael Wolff and this screed for what it is when the subjects he's writing about respond to the book once it's released on the January the 9th.
But let's get real, Mr. Gorka. I mean, who of those people would indeed ever say anything like that of the serving President of the United States on the record?
Well, that's the whole point. That's why the whole thing sounds like somebody's a fever dream of some kind of fantasy from the left. I mean, really, are we supposing that the chief strategist to the president in the West Wing is actually on the record lambasting the president's son? It's from a cheap novel.
Well, I think we are to believe that in some senses, because what does seem to ring true...
You can believe whatever you like. I live in the world of facts, John.
But it is frequently referred to and reported by dependable journalists that there is chaos in the White House.
That's complete and utter garbage. I worked in the White House. This is wishful thinking. 80 and 90% of the stuff I read about, the things that I was involved in the White House, the decisions that were being taken, were diametrically opposed to the reality within the White House. The Guardian fabricated a whole story out of whole cloth with regards to me and my intentions to become the special envoy to Libya. None of it was true, John. That's the level of gutter press we're talking about.
But isn't the very fact that you yourself resigned so soon after Mr. Trump became president testament to the fact that there was chaos there that you couldn't abide?
Have you studied the first year of new presidential administrations? Bill Clinton's administration basically collapsed in the 9th month of his first term. Ronald Reagan, likewise, suffered great turmoil within his White House in the first year. It is standard practice. Why? It takes one set of skills to win a national election and another one to run a White House. This is very much par for the course, and if people don't understand that, they have no sense of history.
Isn't America still waiting for the other one to turn up?
For the other what to turn up?
Well, the other part of the administration that would make sense of the White House, the latter one that you referred to.
John, what are you talking about? We've just broken the 71st stock market record. ISIS's caliphate doesn't exist. We've had unemployment drop to the lowest level in 17 years. There's been a 78 drop in illegal migration across the southern border. NATO is revitalized. What more do you want? This is like the 4th year of a successful administration, all in less than 12 months. This administration should be judged on its achievements, not some scurrilous book that is about painting palace intrigue as fact when it isn't.
Sebastian Gorka, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Now, earlier I spoke to the journalist Joshua Green, also from Washington, D.C. His book, Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump and the Storming of the Presidency, details how Mr. Bannon helped deliver the presidency for Donald Trump. And I started by asking him, what went wrong between the president and his former chief strategist?
Even up until a week or so ago, Trump and Bannon were still talking. Bannon convinced Trump to get involved in the Alabama Senate race and go down and campaign for Roy Moore. The fact that Moore lost and that Trump was humiliated again, I think, is one reason why you saw this angry reaction from Trump in the wake of the book, coming out with a personal statement, assassinating Steve Bannon's character. We've never seen anything like that in Washington before, not even from Donald Trump.
Mr. Trump has described the allegations in Wolf's books as lies, particularly pertaining to Bannon. Are they lies?
Well, no, not at all. I mean, I haven't read all of Wolf's book, but the portrayal he gives is very consistent with the portrayal of Bannon that I had in my book, which is as this swashbuckling, profane, louder-than-life figure who is really the architect of Donald Trump's presidential victory and has a lot in common personally with Trump himself. Both of them have very large egos, they're volcanic, they're combative, and I think it was only a matter of time before the two of them turn against each other.
Where does this play with Special Prosecutor Mueller's investigation? Is this evidence? One presumes he's going to have to take evidence, or may already have done, from Bannon himself. I mean, how does this play?
To be quite honest, I don't think that this has much of an effect on Mueller's investigation at all. He hasn't been deterred by Trump's threats. He is going to and has been speaking with anybody he wants to speak with. He has subpoena power. He's issued indictments. Certainly, Mueller is going to want to talk to Bannon and the people around him if he hasn't already. So I think while this book is titillating and fun to read and talk about, Bannon would already have been on Mueller's interview list, and I don't think anything about the book is going to change that.
So, final question. When Trump says that when Bannon lost his job, he lost his mind, had he?
Had he lost his mind? Well, yeah. I'm not a psychiatrist, and I wouldn't presume to diagnose either one of them. I think you can make a compelling argument on either side. But what's indisputable is that Trump continued to speak and listen to Bannon and to be influenced by Bannon. So, whether or not he lost his mind, Bannon continued to have influence with the president right up until a week or so ago.
The author Joshua Green talking to me earlier from Washington.
The US now on trash, complete fantasy, disgusting, laughable. If you haven't guessed already, that was the response from the White House tonight to a new book that makes Simply extraordinary claims, even by recent standards, about Mr. Trump, his mental state, his family and aides, and even his attitude to the job itself. Excerpts have already come out. Mr. Trump's lawyers were threatening to stop the book being published next Tuesday. Too late, it seems. It is now due out tomorrow.
The exceptionally bleak weather in Washington captured the mood inside the White House as well. Equally fitting was the sudden activation of the building's security alarms. For these are emergency conditions for the president, after his former chief strategist reportedly said that some Trump family members were potentially engaged in money laundering and treason.
Thank you very much. I don't know, he called me a great man last night, so, you know, he obviously changed his tune pretty quick. All right, thank you all very much.
Now Trump is distancing himself from his former top advisor.
I don't talk to him. That's just a misnomer. Thank you.
Donald Trump and Steve Bannon were the closest of allies, the strategists shaping the candidate's nationalist, America First agenda. But a new inside account of life in the White House quotes Bannon as saying that a meeting that the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., held with Russian intermediaries in June 2016 was an act of treason. The president's blistering response was to say that Bannon had lost, along with his job, his mind. It is a spectacular rift. Only a few months ago, Bannon was a key loyalist.
When you side with a man, you side with him, okay? The good and the bad. You can criticize him behind, but when you side with him, you have to side with him.
The book's portrayal of this White House is obviously deeply damaging, describing a paranoid and ill-tempered president. It reports that Trump fears being poisoned, that he increasingly repeats himself. One advisor is quoted as saying, the commander-in-chief has to be managed like a child. Today it led some White House reporters to ask a question few have wanted to pose until now. Is the president in sound mental health?
What's the president's reaction to the growing number of suggestions, both in this book and in the media, that he's mentally unfit to serve as president?
The same way we have when it's been asked before that it's disgraceful and laughable. If he was unfit, he probably wouldn't be sitting there.
This is palace intrigue. It's fluff.
One man very close to both Bannon and Trump is eviscerating the book, calling it unreliable and irrelevant. So just how devastating is it for the Trump presidency to be engaged in this level of sort of psychodrama?
It's a non-event. It's a silly distraction that will have been forgotten a week from now because of everything else that the president's achieved in the last 11 months. You just look at the facts on the ground. Lowest unemployment in 17 years, 78% decrease in illegal migration across the southern border. ISIS decimated.
Hi, Donald John Trump. But those achievements claimed by Trump allies may be overshadowed by the book's extraordinary claims, including that Trump never expected or even wanted to become president in the first place, and that he was furious on Inauguration Day. Tonight it appears his lawyers are losing the battle to halt publication of the book. It will now be released tomorrow, 4 days early.
And Robert joins us now. Robert, we both know, everyone watching this programme knows political books come and go, but even by the standards of what we've discussed about President Trump, this has made extraordinary reading, the extracts. How damaging do you really think it is?
Well, look, Tom, I mean, on one level, in terms of his prestige and the sort of direction of the national conversation, clearly very damaging. But in another sense, this book essentially confirms what has been reported about the White House for the last year, that it's deeply dysfunctional, that it's organizationally chaotic, that there are schisms and rifts and multiple personnel clashes, and that Trump is often ridiculed and mocked by those closest to him. I mean, who can forget that it was his own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who at a Pentagon meeting allegedly called the president a moron. I mean, I think we do know that this president is completely different from all of his predecessors. He consumes information differently. He is preoccupied with TV shows and with Twitter. But I would say this, and it's as true tonight as it was last week or last month, which is there are major forces on the president's side. I mean, firstly, we have a booming economy here. The US stock markets again tonight are at a record high. And secondly, his loyal base of supporters are still there. You know, they wanted a maverick, an insurgent, a disruptor. And they certainly have that.
Well, they really do, Robert. For now, thank you very much indeed.
So plenty around there to talk about with Sonia Soda and Isabel Oakeshott. And you've picked Trump to kick us off.
You can't avoid Trump, he's everywhere.
He is everywhere, certainly on a couple of the front pages and plenty inside as well. There's the Times take on it. They're boasting an exclusive extract from this book that's causing a lot of controversy.
Which I have to say, I'm really quite keen to read, aren't you?
I think it's going to be on both of our order lists quite soon, isn't it?
Sensational stuff. The book's apparently already #1 Amazon bestseller, and so far from
it's not even been published yet.
So far from managing to block it, which is what Trump has been trying to do, a massive rearguard action, the publishers have actually brought forward the date of publication. I think tomorrow, it's coming out tomorrow or even tonight.
That's right, they're hoping it's Friday. So, it was due to be Tuesday.
I mean, the claims that are coming out of this book are quite extraordinary, and, you know, they range from the serious allegation of him potentially not being considered by his own inner circle fit to be president, and I mean real questions over his mental fitness to do the job, but also right down to the kind of the lurid and quite titillating stuff about, you know, his behaviour in relation to women.
Yeah, chasing after his friends' wives. Apparently he saw them as real trophies. He used to get friends into his office, put their wives on speakerphone without telling his friend, and sort of try and entrap his friend into, you know, sort of saying, I've got some women upstairs, do you want to come with me? I mean, it's just really incredible stuff. And it's really, I think...
I like the burger stuff.
Yeah, if it's true, it's just a really scary insight, I think, into his personality. So apparently, you know, when he moved into the White House, he was incredibly paranoid about getting poisoned. McDonald's cheeseburgers...
We're not talking food poisoning that he's worried about. He's worried about being
his
poisoned,
electric toothbrush. So he wouldn't let anybody else touch his electric toothbrush. He insisted on a lock being put on his bedroom, and apparently that led to a bit of a heated discussion with his Secret Service agents, because they need very fast access to his bedroom, and they were sort of saying, you can't have a lock on it. Yes, his meal of choice is McDonald's cheeseburgers. Apparently he has 3 huge TVs installed in his bedroom. He likes to retire at 6:30 p.m.
Not with Melania, we understand.
Not with Melania, who
surprisingly she doesn't want to go to bed at 6 o'clock.
Well, maybe it's because apparently she didn't want to be First Lady. She was crying on election night, and there were not tears of joy. So there's just an incredible sort of set of revelations coming out of this book. And I think the sort of, I mean, obviously we're all reveling in some of these details now. We're all going to be, you know, going away and reading the book over the weekend, probably. But I suppose the big question about all this is, what impact will it have on the Trump presidency and the Trump White House? And, you know, apparently some of his advisors have said, or said to the author of this book, that there are concerns about, as Isabel said, his fitness for office, and whether the 25th Amendment of the American Constitution should be invoked, which is all about a president's fitness for office. And I think it's a really open question as well, what impact this is going to have on his ratings.
Well, yes, but of course he will say it's nonsense, none of this is true. He's got lawyers' letters flying off.
You know, there's a kind of predictable pattern with these sorts of books, not that there's been anything quite like this one, where, you know, a number of people that the author speaks to, I mean, I've been on the sharp end of this myself with the book that I co-authored on David Cameron, you know, a number of your sources who you've got on tape, then, you know, amid the furore, they act surprised that their comments have caused such an outcry, and they come out and say, oh gosh, I've been misquoted, I didn't say that. But I mean, I'm sure the author of this book was highly professional. He says he's got everything on tape. No doubt his sources are going to end up looking even more ridiculous if they claim they didn't say what he's quoted them as saying, and he can demonstrate
Well,
that.
yes, we'll have to wait and see how that does roll out, because, as you say, a lot of people won't have actually seen the copies yet to know what they're being quoted as saying. And there's a double-page spread inside the Times as well, which goes through some of those details. But some of the more serious allegations, as you say, come
Not his Just for Men hair dye.
That's perhaps not one of the more serious ones, but
you're taken by that bit,
I am.
aren't you? Yeah. What is it that he doesn't leave it on long enough?
Apparently, Ivanka said that he doesn't leave it on long enough, which is what creates that lovely orange-yellow colour.
You should be getting it done professionally. You can afford it, right?
You'd have thought.
But there could be a real... I mean, there is obviously clearly a split between him and his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, who today, or last night at least on his radio programme, still called him a great man. And yet some of the quotes attributed to him, talking about Donald Trump Jr., saying he's was treasonous to meet with the Russians. I mean, that could cause a real split in the base, amongst supporters.
That's a very dangerous position for Trump to be in, because at the moment we've seen Bannon has come back and sort of tried to hose this down in a way. He's been quite emollient. He's said, Trump's a great man and I support him every day, and he's trying to sort of patch things over, as it were. But I mean, I suspect that Trump is not a man who forgives too easily. And if this were to escalate, presumably Bannon has an awful lot more that he could say that he hasn't said on tape or not on tape, who knows, already. So he's a very, very dangerous enemy for Trump to make.
And yet Trump supporters will say that they will stick by their man and they will believe him and not those who criticise him.